Good evening, everyone. This is Mr. Miles. I'm going to be talking to you guys today about the goddess Hecate for the Miles Files. We're going to do a deep dive into who she is, what she's all about, and sort of all of the ins and outs regarding who the goddess Hecate actually is, as opposed to maybe her reputation for being just the goddess of witchcraft and darkness. Let's get into it. So, the question that I got was, who is the goddess of witchcraft? Who is Hecate? Let's just start by making sure that we understand. If I were an ancient Greek person, the correct way to pronounce her name would be something more akin to Hecate or Hecate. Um, but I pronounce it the way that I learned to pronounce it, which is through reading Shakespeare, specifically Macbeth, where she is actually a character in the play Macbeth. Um, And so, even though that's not the correct pronunciation, and I'm usually a stickler for pronunciation, this is the one time that I am a hypocrite. I'm just going to call her Hecate, which is the way that Shakespeare pronounced her name. That's what I'm going to call her. But you're free to call her Hecate or Hecate, however you want to pronounce her name. That's probably more accurate. But who is she? So, this is Hecate, the Greek goddess of witchcraft. So, let's start out with some of the early information that we have about Hecate. So, the thing I always like to do when I'm trying to figure out who a god or a goddess or a particular myth, what exactly people believed about it back then, and sort of how that evolved over time, is to sort of always go back to the beginning of it and see what are sort of our first attested uh, appearances of this god or this goddess or of this particular myth, and then just sort of how, as it evolved over time, how did the myth change? How did the perception maybe warp? So that's what we're going to do with Hecate. So our first real source for her appearing as an entity in Greek mythology, as is the case for many of our favorite individuals from Greek mythology, is our good friend Hesiod, this guy right here. So Hesiod wrote the Theogony, which is essentially the birth of the gods, is what that word means in Greek. And so he told us the story about where the universe came from according to Greek mythology. He talks about the Titanomachy, which is the war with the Titans. And he also gives us a couple of interesting nuggets about Hecate, who, again, you ask most people nowadays, uh, just off the street, if they know who Hecate is, they're going to say something along the lines of she's the goddess of witchcraft, which is true. However, uh, she did not start out as some wicked, evil goddess of witchcraft edgelord. She actually started out as a goddess of fertility and children. And Hesiod was actually quite a big fan of her. He spends about a page in the Theogony, which is a considerable portion of the book because the Theogony itself is only about 40 pages long. He spends about an entire page just hyping Hecate and just puffing her up and talking about how cool she is and how he loves Hecate and Hecate's his friend and he just da 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 da. So, what does he actually say about Hecate in the Theogony? So, he talks about how she was a Titan initially, who was spared by Zeus after the war with the Titans. Uh, doesn't really give an explanation as to why. Most of the time, when a Titan is spared by Zeus, that's because they sided with the Greek gods instead of the Titans. For example, Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus. But he doesn't give a reason for why Hecate was spared by Zeus. He just says that Zeus favors her above all the other gods for some reason. So that's interesting. He says that apparently, Zeus liked Hecate so much, he granted her, he granted her a share of the earth, the sea, and the sky. Now, if you remember, this is very similar to the story of how Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades were sort of divided up. The three male children of Cronus, how they were divided up or apportioned their share of the universe after they defeated the Titans. They drew lots. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon got the sea, Hades got the earth or the underworld, right? But let's remember that Hades is not just an underworld god. He is also a god representing the things that are in the earth. He's a god of wealth and the riches that are buried within the earth, as well as being the underworld god. So he's not just dead guy. He is a lot of other things too. So what Hesiod is implying here, to bring it back to Hecate, is that Zeus apparently just decided to give Hecate a slice of all of those pies. Like, sure, he gave Poseidon a majority share in the ownership of the sea, but he gave Hecate a minority share. And he gave Hades a majority share in the ownership of the earth, but he gave Hecate a minority share. So apparently, if we're going to just use like like an economics metaphor, apparently Hecate is like a minority owner in literally the entire universe, which is a pretty big deal. Um, so Hesiod treats her like a fertility goddess. He talks about how she sends up crops from the earth, but he talks about other things that she is really good at, or that she approves of, or that she participates in when it comes to the affairs of mortals. Um, he calls her a goddess who guides good judgment in public forums and sits by the right hand of kings, which, all right, makes her sound very important when it comes to legal matters. Uh, he calls her a granter of victory in battle. That people who are warriors who pray to Hecate for victory in battle, apparently she delivers victory, particularly cavalry for some reason. She grants victory to athletes who pray to her before battle. She works with Poseidon to help fishermen. Because I guess remember she has a minority stake in the ocean, so any fisherman who prays for a good catch, Hecate's the one who helps them out there. Hermes, she works with him to provide good herds, healthy herds, big herds for farmers. Um, she is described as a caretaker of young children. She apparently has a very large interest in nurturing and taking care of little tykes for some reason. So that is a very common thing that Hesiod brings up. So if you're looking at all this, you realize that she has not gained any of these like dark, edgy, witch-like connotations yet, right? Nothing about what Hesiod describes her as makes her sound like she is a dark, mysterious figure. She's just, according to Hesiod, from his point of view, she's just the coolest goddess ever, I guess. So, all right, where else can we maybe trace some of her uh, witchy origins to? Where can we sort of find maybe the impetus or the original point where maybe some of that started to come to fruition? Well, we can do that by looking at the Homeric hymns. And if you don't know what the Homeric hymns are, they're exactly kind of what they sound like. They are hymns to the gods, most of the Olympian gods, with some other minor gods thrown in there too, like Selene and some other ones. And they were written not actually by Homer, but sort of around the time period of Homer, sort of the Greek Dark Ages, the period we call from like the 10th century BC up to like the 5th century BC. Or I guess would be the 6th century BC. So in that time frame, about 400 years, we call those the Greek Dark Ages. That's when Homer was when alive, if Homer existed, but we're not getting into that. So some people want to claim that these were written by Homer, but most scholars say that the Homeric hymns were not actually written by Homer. They're just called Homeric because they were written in that time frame. But regardless, one of the hymns is to Demeter. And in that hymn, we actually get some very interesting little pieces of evidence, clues as to maybe who Hecate is. So most of them are talking about Demeter. Again, Demeter is the goddess of fertility, agriculture, vegetation. So associating her with Hecate is, again, pointing to her original conception as a goddess of the earth, as a goddess of fertility. So the first quote from the Homeric hymn to Demeter is she's described as having a bright headdress. That's about all we get from that line. A more interesting one is it describes Demeter searching for her daughter Persephone after Hades abducted her and took her under the earth. Apparently, Hecate is the goddess who assists Demeter in searching for Persephone. And here we see the first mention of sort of the famous iconography that's always going to be associated with Hecate from here on out, which is the fact that she is wielding torches. And here is actually a depiction of Hecate from a Greek vase, and you can sort of kind of see. I mean, they just look like sticks, but if you sort of follow my cursor, you can sort of see the traces of where the flames used to be from her torches. So she's holding torches, and that's a very common piece of iconography that you're going to see over and over and over for Demeter, or excuse me, for Hecate. So another line: Hecate came from near at hand, lavished fond embraces on holy Demeter's child. Her usher and helper, the lady, has been from this time forward. So this last line to me is probably ground zero for where we would eventually get the darker, more witchcraft connotations for Hecate, which is after Persephone is returned to her mother, I guess as sort of a repayment for helping Demeter search for her. Hecate becomes essentially Persephone's. The word that my translation uses is usher and helper. And obviously, Persephone is associated as the goddess of spring, but she's also associated with the underworld. She's Hades' bride. And so, obviously, that word usher makes Hecate sound sort of like a guide to souls from life to death, right? Like she helps guide souls from the living world to the unliving world. And that is actually going to be a very, very important part of her later character as her myths sort of develop. That she is this usher to the underworld, a psychopomp, right? Which is the technical term for what we call these sorts of beings like Hermes. Like the Valkyries in Norse mythology, she guides people to the underworld uh, to her sort of, I guess, boss, who is Persephone. Although maybe you could make the case that she's not subservient to Persephone. That they're more on equal footing because she's not described as Persephone's servant. She's described as Persephone's helper, Persephone's usher. So, and again, if Hesiod is to be believed, then she's pretty powerful in her own right. So I think that's sort of the ground zero for where we get all of the darker connotations with Hecate. But where is all the spooky stuff? Well, like I said, her early associations with Persephone and with the underworld um, probably made her over time become more and more associated with death and with ghosts and with darkness and with night. Um, so we call those chthonic goddesses or gods, things that are associated with the underworld. And so I think it's that association with Persephone and the underworld that she would later on develop these traits. So first off, let's talk about her name. Uh, there's actually a lot we can actually glean from just analyzing the name Hecate. So the most commonly accepted translation of her name means worker from afar or something along those lines. She who works from afar, which is very similar to the epithet of Apollo, which is called, some translations call it the far shooter, some call him the far darter, um, the far archer, however you want to describe it. But that's essentially the same epithet that is used to describe Hecate. Uh, but with Hecate, the connotation is more witchcraft, right? Like with witchcraft, you can hurt a person without being far away from them. So the worker from afar makes it sound like she is hurting people, even though she is not in their vicinity, because all you have to do is cast a spell. And that becomes very important to her sort of mythology. Um, and the association with Apollo, I think it's very interesting that her name is Hecate. Apollo has an epithet Hekatos, which is very similar to her name, and later in Greek writings, Hecate is associated with Artemis, who obviously is the twin of Apollo, because she's associated with night, with the moon. Um, so there's some similarities there, and there's actually a very specific myth that Hecate and Artemis kind of share with one another as well. So maybe there's some Artemis, Hecate, one goddess maybe merging from two, stuff going on later, which we'll talk about. But another interpretation of her name that I have seen is that it is very similar to the Greek word for 100, which is where we get our word hecatomb, which is what you would describe. This is the word for basically you sacrifice 100 head of cattle or 100 head of oxen, in one big mass public sacrifice. Um, and obviously, you don't sacrifice 100 of cows unless you are really desperate for some good luck or some good fortune. So that could also be a reference to her past as a fertility goddess. So let's actually get into the wicked stuff or the witchy stuff. So around the 5th century BC, we finally start to get some writers um, kind of invoke her as a dark god or goddess. So in Euripides, Medea invokes Hecate, and in the Argonautica, Medea again is sort of a priestess of Hecate, and that's sort of one of the big associations that Hecate has with witchcraft. Is so one of the most famous, if not the most famous witch in Greek mythology, Medea. She is a worshiper of Hecate, so there's that association. But also, not in literature, in just everyday inscriptions that survive, we have these things called curse tablets. And curse tablets were essentially lead blocks where if I wanted something bad to happen to my enemy, if I wanted them to go out of business, or if I wanted all their cows to get sick and die, or if I wanted uh, his wife to break her neck, or if I wanted my lover rival to, fall out of love with someone or fall in love with someone else, right? If I wanted to just, screw up someone's life, what I would do is I would take a block of lead and I would carve their names into it. I would carve my name into it. And then I would probably write down the name of the god or the goddess that I would invoke in order to make this happen. Sometimes it's Zeus because he's all powerful. Maybe if I want someone to drown at sea, I'd invoke Poseidon. But a lot of times we see these cursed tablets um, invoking Hecate. And then what you would do is you would drop this cursed tablet into, the ocean or drop it into a well or something, and you would, hopefully the gods would read it and they would do something about it. But anyway, a lot of these cursed tablets invoke Hecate. So here are some of the the most interesting cursed tablets. I will bind my enemy in blood and dust with all the dead. Very spooky. And that later on, that particular curse tablet actually mentions Hecate by name. Hecate punishes Megara, who is the person being cursed in this particular tablet. Persephone reports it to the gods. So it almost makes it sound like Hecate is the one doing the punishing, and Persephone is just the the scribe, the the court reporter, so to speak. This is my favorite one, the third one here. I bind Sosiclea and her possessions and her great renown and her business and her mind. May she become an enemy to all of her friends. I will bind her beneath murky Tartarus in painful bonds, together with the Chthonian Hecate and with the Furies who render people foolish. So, whoever this person was, they really didn't like Sosiclea for whatever reason. And so this person curses all of her possessions, all of her friends, all of her business, even her own mind and her sanity, and says, I hope she burns in Tartarus for all eternity. Um, Another thing that the gods of the writers of the 5th century said about Hecate was that she guarded the gates to Hades, that she's, I guess, essentially the prison warden for the dead in Hades. And she even had the keys to Cerberus's chain, um, or his collar. And so, if Cerberus were ever unleashed, it was Hecate who was doing the unleashing, which I found to be interesting. Um, because she was sort of the gatekeeper, so to speak, of the underworld, she could send forth ghosts at her beck and call, to the world of the living. That's kind of, the thing that we want to sort of talk about a little bit, because a lot of people seem to think that the underworld in Greek mythology is a place that it's like the Hotel California. Once you check in, you can never check out. Um, but Hecate, I think, is the exception to that rule, because she sends sort of wronged spirits and angry ghosts forth into the land of the living, and so that's sort of her shtick. Um, and she's always, wherever she walks, she's accompanied by, the actual term is Stygian dogs, dogs from the river Styx. Most translations I have found just call them hellhounds, I guess, because it's easier to wrap our head around. But to me, the idea of Stygian dogs is very interesting, because there sort of implies the river Styx being poisonous, being, sort of this almost leprous thing, right? So it makes me think that the dogs almost have this uh, diseased aura about them. Um, but apparently, one of the dogs that she travels with actually was, of all people, the wife of Priam, the king of Troy, Hecuba. Now, if you remember anything from the Trojan War, Hecuba really had it rough. She and Priam had 50 kids together, and most of those kids died during the Trojan War. Most of those kids Hecuba saw die during the Trojan War. And also, she watched Priam get butchered right in front of her. She was taken as one of the slaves, one of the Trojan women slaves, by the Greeks. Apparently, she, according to some variations of the myth, was literally metamorphosed into a dog and became, I guess, Hecate's sort of bloodthirsty companion, because Hecuba's so full of rage, that she just wants to take it out on anybody she can as an evil dog. Um, so Hecate has another nickname that you will see as you study Hecate, which is Enodia, which literally translates to the one at the roadways, which I find to be interesting because it kind of implies that she's more than just the spooky goddess of witchcraft. She's a goddess of liminal spaces. And if you don't know what the word liminal means, that just means that she's the goddess of spaces that are between spaces. So a liminal space is just a space between a space. So, for example, it's like the vestibule in a church, right? It's the place that you stop at for a moment before you transition from the outside to the inner sanctuary of a church, right? Like, so liminal spaces are just the places between. She's often depicted as the goddess of crossroads. So typically, most people, if they wanted to seek out Hecate and become better witches, they would do so at night at a crossroads, typically at the joining of three roads. And the reason for this is because, again, this is where the roads would conjoin. It's sort of like this liminal space, like, what road am I really on? And that's why some depictions of Hecate, like this one, have her as having three faces, right? One facing each direction of the roadway. Um, she also had shrines outside of homes, right? So the sort of border between a person's property and another person's property, outside city walls, the border between the city and the country. And she also, to kind of call back to her underworld association, she was found, you know, wandering the world of the living, but could also travel at will to the land of the dead and back and forth and back and forth. And she could call forth ghosts and summon them back to Hades. So she was a liminal goddess in that way as well, that the world, that the sort of binary of the living world and the unliving world didn't really matter that much to her. And she was also described as being found near the blood of murdered persons. So again, death and life, the line separating those two is a lot more blurred when it comes to Hecate. Just a little fun fact, though. Again, if you wanted to make a sacrifice or a little offering to Hecate, you would do that by leaving your sacrifices at a crossroads. However, what sort of sacrifices would those be? So, fun fact: Hecate loved cake. She loved specifically honey cakes, and what you would do is you would take a honey cake and you'd put little candles on it, and then you'd leave those honey cakes at the crossroads for Hecate. Um, and so, again, when I say Hecate likes birthday cakes, you could make the case that birthday cakes are what Hecate loves the most. Also, puppies. So Hecate was always associated with dogs, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But because of that, rather than sacrificing goats or sacrificing cows or anything like that, if you were a witch and you worshipped Hecate, the way that you got into her good graces was by taking a puppy and leaving it in a basket, sacrificed to her at the crossroads. Uh, so we'll come back to the dog piece in a second. This is just some other random trivia about Hecate. Fun fact, by the way, trivia, the word trivia, is actually another epithet of the goddess Hecate. So again, this goes back to her connotations with roads and things like that. But if you go and you look at the nicknames of the goddess Hecate, you'll see Enodia and also Trivia. So, fun fact. But anyway, other random trivia about Hecate in the war with the giants, not to be confused with the war with the Titans, the Titanomachy was against the Titans, who were the children of Uranus and Gaia. Here, the Gigantonomachy, which is a word I can never say, uh, that was a war between the children of Gaia, who she just wanted to take revenge on the gods for what they did to her other children, the Titans. But anyway, during the war with the giants, uh, Hecate fought on the side of the gods, and she killed a giant named Clytius with her torches. That's what most versions of the giant war have her do. There is one version of the giant war where she kills Clytius by using a dog, and she just like sicks the dog on him. Um, and that kind of segues into Hecate is always associated with dogs. If you can think of a myth that has a dog in it, there's probably a chance that Hecate is involved in it in some way. Um, so she is connected to the myth of Actaeon, who, if you remember, he is the guy. He was out hunting in the forest one day and he accidentally stumbled upon Artemis, who was bathing, and Artemis, who was a virgin goddess and incredibly protective of her chastity, um, did not take his blundering into the water and seeing her bathing. He did not. She did not care that that was an accident. So she sicked his own hunting dogs on him after turning him into a deer. And his own hunting dogs ripped him apart. In one version of the myth, Hecate is there with her, and she is actually the one who makes his dogs so irate and aggressive, and she's the one who makes the dogs actually rip him apart. And that it was Artemis who just turned him into a stag. Uh, which again, there's some commonalities between Hecate and Artemis, and there is another sort of thing to think about, just as like, okay, well, here's a myth where Artemis and Hecate are working together to ruin this guy. Um, there are other little stories. she's connected to Scylla, one of her or Scylla. One of her epithets is, and I don't remember the actual Greek word for it, but it's basically just like Scylla friend. Um, and So she's connected with Scylla, and if you know anything about Scylla, aside from what maybe you've seen on Epic the Musical, Scylla has a lower half that is basically seven dog heads. Um, so again, she's connected to dogs. And in one painting that we have that survives, Hecate is actually hanging out with the Furies, um, and she has man-eating dogs for feet. So there's just a lot of connotations with dogs when it comes to Hecate. So, to conclude, she's a goddess of darkness, witches, curses, demons, ghosts, everything spooky that you could possibly imagine. All of that stuff is true. All of that stuff is attested in the texts that we have. But she's not just a goddess of those things. She's also a goddess who loves puppies, children, and cake. So, yeah, that is the wonderful, weird story of Hecate, and that is what she is all about. I could go on and on and on, but this video is already long enough. So, yeah, mythology. It's fun stuff. So, that's it for the Miles Files this week, and I will see y'all in the next week. Let me know what you want me to talk about.